He was 73 years old and he had nothing left to lose. His name was Robert Chen, and he was standing outside a gleaming glass building in downtown Manhattan, holding a folder that contained his entire reason for being alive. Inside that folder was a medical report about his grandson, Marcus, 12 years old, diagnosed with acute leukemia. Inside that folder was a treatment plan that could save Marcus's life. And inside that folder was a price tag. $500,000. Robert didn't have $500,000. He had a pension of $1,200 a month. He had a small apartment in Queens. He had a car that was held together by prayers and duct tape. He had nothing. But he had heard that the man who owned this building, Alexander Steele, one of the richest men in America, had donated millions to children's hospitals. He had heard that Alexander Steele was a man who believed in second chances. And so Robert had decided to do something that terrified him. He had decided to ask for help. Before we start this story, I need you to understand what you're about to see. This is not a simple story about charity. This is a story about human dignity. This is a story about what happens when someone in need encounters someone with power. This is a story about the choices we make when we're faced with someone else's suffering. This is a story that will challenge you to think about what kind of person you want to be. This is the story of Robert Chen and Alexander Steele. And it will teach you something fundamental about mercy, about redemption, and about what it really means to be human. Let's begin. Robert had raised Marcus since the boy was born. Marcus's parents had died in a car accident when Marcus was 2 years old. Robert's daughter and son-in-law had been driving home from work when a truck had crossed the median. They died instantly. Robert had been devastated, but he'd also been clear about one thing. He would raise Marcus. He would be there for his grandson. He would give Marcus the life that his parents couldn't. For 10 years, Robert had done exactly that. He'd worked as a mechanic until his arthritis made it impossible. He'd picked Marcus up from school. He'd helped him with homework. He'd gone to his soccer games and his school plays. He'd been present in a way that his own father had never been present for him. And Marcus had thrived. The boy was intelligent and kind and funny. He had dreams of becoming a doctor. He had a girlfriend named Jenny who was equally smart. He had a future that looked bright and full of possibility. And then, 3 months ago, Marcus had gotten sick. It had started with fatigue. Marcus had complained that he was tired all the time. Robert had thought it was just adolescence. But then Marcus had started getting nosebleeds. Then he'd started bruising easily. Then one day, Marcus had collapsed at school. The doctors had done tests. And they'd delivered news that had shattered Robert's world. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the doctor had said. Stage 3. Robert had asked what that meant. The doctor had explained that it was cancer of the blood cells. It was aggressive. It was life-threatening. But it was also treatable. With the right treatment, Marcus had a good chance of survival. How good a chance? Robert had asked. If he receives aggressive chemotherapy and a bone marrow transplant, I'd say 70 to 80% survival rate, the doctor had said. Robert had felt relief wash over him. 70 to 80%. That meant Marcus could survive. That meant his grandson had a future. But then the doctor had mentioned the cost. The treatment plan we're recommending will cost approximately $500,000, the doctor had said. That includes the chemotherapy, the bone marrow transplant, the hospitalization, the follow-up care. Insurance will cover some of it, but you're looking at out-of-pocket costs of at least $500,000. Robert had felt the ground beneath him disappear. $500,000. He made $1,200 a month on his pension. That was $14,400 a year. To earn $500,000, it would take him 35 years. Marcus didn't have 35 years. Marcus had maybe 6 months before the leukemia would become untreatable. Robert had tried everything. He'd applied for medical loans. He'd been rejected. He'd asked for help from charity organizations. They'd put him on waiting lists that would take months to process. He'd asked family members for money. Some had offered small amounts, $5,000 here, $3,000 there. But it was nowhere near enough. And then, one day, while Robert was watching the news, he'd seen a story about Alexander Steele. Alexander Steele was a billionaire real estate mogul. He'd built an empire that included office buildings, residential complexes, and shopping centers across the country. He was worth approximately $4.3 billion. And he was known for his philanthropy. The news story showed Alexander Steele donating $10 million to a children's hospital in Boston. The anchor had described him as a man who believes in the power of generosity and someone who has dedicated significant resources to helping children in need. Robert had watched that story and he'd thought, this man gives away millions. Surely he could spare $500,000 to save a child's life. It was probably naive. It was probably desperate. But Robert was desperate. He'd researched Alexander Steele. He'd found the address of Steele's corporate headquarters in Manhattan. He'd written a letter explaining his situation. He'd included Marcus's medical reports. He'd included a photo of Marcus, a bright-eyed, smiling 12-year-old boy who had his whole life ahead of him. He'd mailed the letter to Alexander Steele's office. He'd waited. 2 weeks passed. No response. Robert had called the office. The receptionist had told him that Mr. Steele received hundreds of requests for charitable donations every week. She'd suggested that he apply through the official charitable foundation. Robert had applied through the foundation. He'd filled out forms. He'd provided documentation. He'd been told that his request would be reviewed and that he would hear back within 6 to 8 weeks. Marcus didn't have 6 to 8 weeks. The cancer was advancing. Marcus was losing his hair from the chemotherapy. He was losing weight. He was growing weaker every day. And Robert had made a decision. He was going to go to Alexander Steele's office in person. He was going to tell his story face to face. He was going to look this man in the eye and he was going to ask for help. It was a Tuesday morning when Robert walked into the lobby of the Steele building in Manhattan. He was wearing the nicest clothes he owned, a sport coat that he'd bought 15 years ago, khaki pants, and dress shoes that had been polished to a shine. He was carrying the folder with Marcus's medical records. He was carrying a photo of Marcus. He was carrying his dignity and his desperation in equal measure. He approached the reception desk. "I'd like to speak with Alexander Steele," Robert said. "It's about a charitable donation. It's urgent." The receptionist looked at him with the expression of someone who had heard this request 1,000 times before. "Mr. Steele doesn't take walk-in visitors," she said. "You need to go through the proper channels. Have you applied to the Steele Foundation?" "I have," Robert said. "But my grandson is running out of time. He has leukemia. He needs treatment. I'm asking for help." The receptionist's expression softened slightly, but her answer remained the same. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you. Mr. Steele is in meetings all day. You'll need to wait for the foundation's decision." Robert had stood there, holding his folder, feeling the weight of his powerlessness. He'd come all this way. He'd taken a day off work. He'd spent money he didn't have on the train fare. And he was being turned away. He'd turned to leave. And that's when something unexpected had happened. A man had stepped out of the elevator. He was tall, in his mid-50s, wearing an expensive suit. He had the bearing of someone accustomed to power. He was Alexander Steele. Robert had made a split-second decision. He'd approached the man. "Mr. Steele," Robert had said, "my name is Robert Chen. I sent you a letter about my grandson. He has leukemia. He needs $500,000 for treatment. I'm asking you to help save his life." Alexander Steele had stopped. He'd looked at Robert with an expression of mild annoyance. "I receive hundreds of requests like this every week," Alexander had said. "Thousands, actually. If I helped everyone who came to me with a sob story, I'd be bankrupt." "It's not a sob story," Robert had said. "It's my grandson's life." Alexander had looked at Robert for a moment, and then he'd done something that would haunt Robert for the rest of his life. He'd laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. It wasn't a sympathetic laugh. It was a laugh of condescension. It was the laugh of someone who found Robert's desperation amusing. "You come into my building," Alexander had said, "uninvited, and you ask me for $500,000? Do you understand how unrealistic that is? Do you understand how many people would like to have my money? Everyone wants something from me." "My grandson is dying," Robert had said quietly. "Everyone's dying," Alexander had said. "That's not my problem." And then he'd walked away. But Alexander Steele hadn't just walked away. He'd decided to humiliate Robert further. He'd called over one of his executives, a woman named Catherine who worked in the corporate development division. "This gentleman," Alexander had said, gesturing to Robert, "thinks I should give him $500,000 for his grandson's medical treatment. I'd like you to explain to him why that's not going to happen. I'd like you to explain to him how our company works. I'd like you to explain to him the actual value of $500,000 in the context of our revenue." Catherine had looked uncomfortable, but she'd complied. She'd brought Robert to a conference room. She'd pulled up financial statements on her laptop. "The steel company generates approximately $200 million in revenue annually," Catherine had explained. $500,000 is 0.25% of our annual revenue. That's equivalent to asking someone who makes $100,000 a year for $250. Then why can't he do it? Robert had asked. He could spend $250 and save my grandson's life. "Because he doesn't see it that way," Catherine had said. "He sees charitable giving as a tax write-off and a way to build his public image. Your grandson isn't famous. Your case isn't high profile. There's no publicity benefit to helping you." Robert had felt something break inside him. He'd understood, in that moment, that he was dealing with a different species of human being. Someone for whom money wasn't just money. It was power. It was a way of determining who deserved help and who didn't. "What if I made it public?" Robert had asked. "What if I told the media that Alexander Steele refused to help a dying child?" Catherine had smiled sadly. He'd release a statement saying that he donates millions to various charitable causes, and that while he sympathizes with your situation, he can't help every individual case. And people would accept that. Because that's how power works. People with power get to define the narrative. Robert had walked out of that building feeling more desperate and more humiliated than he'd ever felt in his life. Marcus's condition worsened. Without the money for the full treatment plan, Robert could only afford the basic chemotherapy that the insurance would cover. But that chemotherapy alone wasn't enough to cure the leukemia. Robert had watched his grandson deteriorate. He'd watched Marcus lose his hair. He'd watched Marcus lose weight. He'd watched Marcus lose hope. One day, Marcus had asked Robert a question that had broken his heart. "Grandpa, am I going to die?" Marcus had asked. Robert had wanted to lie. He'd wanted to tell Marcus that everything would be okay. But Marcus deserved honesty. "I don't know, buddy," Robert had said. "I'm trying everything I can to help you. But I'm doing my best." "I know you are," Marcus had said. "But your best might not be enough." And that was the truth that Robert had been avoiding. His best might not be enough. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he sacrificed, his best might not save his grandson's life. Robert had become obsessed with finding money. He'd taken out loans against his apartment. He'd sold his car. He'd taken a job working nights at a hospital, despite his arthritis, because the pay was slightly better than his previous job. And slowly, painfully, he'd accumulated money. By the time Marcus's condition had become critical, Robert had managed to save $180,000. It wasn't enough. But it was something. The doctors had told Robert that with $180,000 and the insurance coverage, they could provide Marcus with a modified treatment plan. It wouldn't be as aggressive as the ideal plan, but it might be enough to save his life. It was a gamble, but it was the only option Robert had. Marcus had undergone chemotherapy. He'd spent 3 months in the hospital. He'd suffered through nausea and pain and the fear of death. But he'd survived. The leukemia had gone into remission. Robert had cried when the doctors told him. He'd cried because his grandson was going to live. He'd cried because he'd sacrificed everything and it had been enough. But the story doesn't end there. Because 6 months later, Marcus's cancer had returned. The remission had been temporary. The cancer had come back, more aggressive than before. And this time, the doctors had been clear. Marcus needed the bone marrow transplant. He needed the aggressive chemotherapy. He needed the full treatment plan. And he needed it now. Robert had felt despair wash over him. He'd sacrificed everything. He'd borrowed money. He'd sold possessions. And it hadn't been enough. He'd been sitting in the hospital cafeteria, drinking terrible coffee, when he'd received a phone call. It had been from Alexander Steele's office. "Is this Robert Chen?" The voice on the phone had asked. "Yes," Robert had said, confused. "This is Catherine Martinez from the Steele Company. I need to tell you something. And I need you to listen very carefully." Catherine had explained what had happened. Alexander Steele had a daughter. Her name was Victoria. Victoria was 30 years old. She was a doctor, specifically, an oncologist specializing in pediatric leukemia. Victoria worked at the hospital where Marcus was being treated. Victoria had treated Marcus when he'd first been diagnosed. Victoria had seen Robert begging in the hallway of the hospital, trying to figure out how to pay for treatment. Victoria had heard about Robert's encounter with her father at the Steele building. And Victoria had been furious. "My father told me what he did," Catherine had explained. "He told me that he'd refused to help you." And Victoria lost it. She told him that he was a monster. She told him that he was everything that was wrong with wealthy people in this country. She told him that she was ashamed to be his daughter. "Why are you telling me this?" Robert had asked. "Because Victoria convinced her father to help you," Catherine had said. "He's going to pay for Marcus's full treatment plan. He's going to cover the entire cost, the chemotherapy, the bone marrow transplant, the follow-up care. Everything." Robert had felt his knees weaken. He'd thought he was going to faint. "Why?" he had asked. "Why would he do this? He humiliated me." "Because his daughter made him understand something," Catherine had said. "She made him understand that money isn't just about having power. It's about having the ability to save lives. And she made him understand that he'd been using his power in the wrong way." Victoria had done more than convince her father to pay for Marcus's treatment. She had personally overseen his care. She had been the doctor who administered his chemotherapy. She had been the surgeon who performed his bone marrow transplant. And she had been the physician who had ultimately saved his life. Marcus had undergone the aggressive treatment plan. It had been brutal. He'd spent months in the hospital. He'd suffered through pain and sickness and fear. But he'd survived. And this time, the remission had been permanent. The cancer hadn't returned. Robert had wanted to thank Alexander Steele. But Victoria had asked him not to. "My father didn't help you because he's a good person," Victoria had said. "He helped you because I forced him to. And that's a lesson he needs to learn. He needs to understand that having power means having responsibility. He needs to understand that money without compassion is just a number." Robert had spent time with Victoria while Marcus was being treated. He'd learned her story. He'd learned that she'd become a doctor specifically because she'd wanted to help people. He'd learned that she'd spent years trying to get her father to understand the difference between charity and compassion. "He gives money away," Victoria had told Robert. "But he doesn't give himself. He doesn't give his time. He doesn't give his attention. And that's the real gift. Not the money but the presence. Not the check but the care." A year after Marcus's recovery, something unexpected happened. Alexander Steele had a heart attack. He'd survived the heart attack, but it had been a wake-up call. He'd spent decades building an empire. He'd spent decades accumulating wealth. And he'd realized, lying in a hospital bed, that none of it mattered. What mattered was his daughter. What mattered was the people whose lives he could touch. What mattered was the difference he could make. Alexander had done something radical. He'd stepped down as CEO of his company. He'd turned over day-to-day operations to his executive team. And he'd decided to spend his remaining years actually using his wealth to help people. He'd established the Marcus Chen Foundation for Pediatric Leukemia Research and Treatment. He'd committed $50 million to the foundation, and he'd asked Victoria to oversee it. Victoria had transformed the foundation into something extraordinary. She'd created programs that provided free treatment to children with leukemia whose families couldn't afford it. She'd funded research into new treatments. She'd created a support network for families dealing with childhood cancer. And Robert had become the foundation's director of patient relations. He'd spent his days listening to families in crisis, helping them navigate the system, and providing them with hope. But the real transformation had come in Alexander's relationship with his daughter. For years, Victoria had been estranged from her father. She'd been angry at him. She'd despised the way he used his money to avoid real human connection. But now, working alongside him at the foundation, something had shifted. Victoria had realized that her father was genuinely trying to change. He was genuinely trying to become a better person. And she had decided to forgive him. Not because what he'd done to Robert was forgivable, but because she could see that he was finally understanding what it meant to be human. He was finally understanding that wealth without compassion was empty. 5 years after Robert had walked into Alexander Steele's office, the man had called him into his private office. "I want to apologize," Alexander had said, "for how I treated you, for humiliating you, for refusing to help your grandson." Robert had not expected an apology. He'd moved past that moment. He'd forgiven Alexander, not because Alexander deserved forgiveness, but because holding on to anger was destroying Robert's peace. "I appreciate that," Robert had said. "But I want to do more than apologize," Alexander had said. "I want to tell you something that I've come to understand. When you walked into my building that day, you weren't asking for charity. You were asking for humanity. You were asking me to see you as a human being. And I failed to do that." Alexander had paused. "My daughter taught me what you were asking for," he'd continued. "She taught me that the most important thing we can give each other is presence. Not money, not charity, but genuine human presence. The willingness to see another person suffering and to acknowledge it and to care about it." Robert had cried as he'd listened to this. "Your grandson is alive," Alexander had said. "Not because I eventually gave money, but because my daughter was willing to give her time and her expertise and her genuine care. That's what saved Marcus's life. Not my wealth, but her presence." Marcus had gone on to become a doctor himself. He'd decided, while recovering from his cancer, that he wanted to help other children facing serious illness. He'd gone to medical school. He'd become a pediatrician. And he'd volunteered with the Marcus Chen Foundation, helping to provide medical care to children whose families couldn't afford it. Jenny, Marcus's girlfriend, had stuck by him through his illness. They'd eventually gotten married. They'd had 2 children. And they'd named their oldest daughter Victoria, after the doctor who'd saved Marcus's life. Robert had lived to be 83 years old. He'd spent the last decade of his life working at the Marcus Chen Foundation, helping families navigate the healthcare system, providing hope to people in crisis. When Robert had died, over 500 people had attended his funeral. There were families he'd helped. There were doctors he'd worked with. There was Alexander Steele, now in his 90s, reflecting on how a desperate old man had taught him the most important lesson of his life. Alexander Steele had lived to be 96 years old. And in his final years, confined to a wheelchair, his body failing but his mind still sharp, he'd done something unexpected. He'd written a memoir. But not the kind of memoir that billionaires typically write. Boastful, self-congratulatory, focused on business achievements and financial milestones. Instead, he'd written a confession. A reckoning. A spiritual autobiography about the man he'd been and the man he'd finally learned to become. The memoir was titled, "The Day I Lost Everything and Found Myself." In that memoir, he'd told the story of the day Robert Chen had walked into his office. But he'd told it with brutal honesty. He'd told it in a way that exposed not just his cruelty, but the systematic blindness that had created that cruelty. And as he'd written those words, Alexander had finally come to terms with what he'd spent most of his life running from. He'd written, I've spent my entire life accumulating wealth. Not out of necessity. I was born into privilege. My father was wealthy. His father before him had been wealthy. I'd never known hunger. I'd never known real struggle. I'd never known what it felt like to be desperate. Yet I accumulated more. And more. And more. Not out of necessity. I had more than I could ever need by the time I was 30. Not out of desire for security. I'd always had more than enough security. I accumulated wealth because I'd been taught from my earliest days that wealth equals worth. That money equals power. That the size of your bank account determines your value as a human being. My father had been the same way. He'd built his fortune through ruthlessness and intelligence. He'd looked down on people who weren't wealthy. He'd called them the common people, and the way he'd said it had made it clear that common meant inferior. He'd taught me that poor people were poor because they were weak or lazy or stupid. He'd taught me that the wealthy deserved their wealth because they were superior. Morally superior, intellectually superior, fundamentally superior as human beings. And I believed him. For 70 years I believed him. 70 years of my life was built on that belief. 70 years of treating people like they were beneath me. 70 years of using my money as a weapon to dominate and control. 70 years of looking at suffering and deciding it wasn't my problem. As Alexander had written those words, he'd felt something he rarely felt, genuine shame. Not embarrassment. Not social discomfort. But deep spiritual shame about who he'd been and what he'd done. He'd continued, I built my empire on that belief. I accumulated billions of dollars. I fired employees who didn't meet my expectations, without thinking about what would happen to them, to their families, to their ability to survive. I negotiated deals that hurt other people financially so that I could make more money. I looked at people like Robert Chen, desperate, struggling, begging for help, and I felt contempt. I felt superiority. I felt like they were somehow less than me because they didn't have the resources I had. I felt like their poverty was evidence of their weakness. And then he'd reached the part of the memoir that had been the most difficult to write. The part where he'd recounted the day Robert Chen had walked into his office. I remember that morning clearly. Alexander had written. I'd just closed a real estate deal worth $400 million. I was feeling invincible. I was on top of the world. The receptionist had mentioned something about an old man wanting to see me, but I dismissed it immediately. My time was too valuable to spend on random people off the street. Why would I? Thousands of people wanted my attention. Thousands of people would have paid enormous sums just to speak to me for 5 minutes. And this was just some old man, some nobody with some kind of request. But Robert had found me in the lobby. And instead of being intimidated by my power, instead of showing the proper deference to a man of my stature, he'd simply asked for help. He'd asked for $500,000 to save his grandson's life. He'd asked me as if I was a human being capable of compassion, instead of treating me like the god I'd come to believe I was. And I laughed at him. That moment, that laugh, has haunted me for the rest of my life. Because in that moment, I didn't just refuse to help. I humiliated him. I made him feel small in front of my staff. I used my power deliberately, intentionally, to make his desperation seem ridiculous. I used my wealth as a weapon. I remember the look on his face. I remember how the color drained from his cheeks. I remember how his hands gripped that folder. The folder containing his entire reason for being alive, his entire hope. I remember how he'd been willing to humble himself in front of me, to beg, to be vulnerable, in order to save the life of someone he loved. And I remember not caring. I remember thinking that he was one of thousands of people who would ask me for money. I remember thinking that if I helped him, I'd have to help everyone. I remember thinking that his grandson's life was not my responsibility. I remember feeling annoyed at him for interrupting my day with his desperation. I was catastrophically wrong about all of that. As Alexander had written his memoir, he'd tried to explain the philosophy of money that had governed his life for so long. He'd tried to articulate how he'd come to understand money not as a tool for living, but as a tool for power. And he'd tried to explain why that understanding had been so fundamentally dehumanizing. For most of my life, I understood money as a tool for accumulating power, he'd written. I understood it as a way to buy things. Houses, cars, influence, respect. I understood it as a scorecard for how successful I was, how superior I was to other people. Every dollar I made was another point in the game I was playing. And the game was, who could accumulate the most? Who could be the most powerful? Who could dominate the most? But Robert Chen taught me something different. He taught me that money is actually a tool for exercising power over people's lives. And once you understand that, once you truly understand that, you realize that how you use that power is perhaps the most important moral decision you'll ever make. When Robert asked me for $500,000, he wasn't asking me to give up a meaningful portion of my wealth. He wasn't asking me to sacrifice in any real sense. I'd made $400 million that same month. $500,000 was less than a rounding error in my finances. He was asking me to exercise the power I had in a way that would save a human life. He was asking me to be merciful. And I refused. Not because I couldn't afford it. Not because I had other, more important uses for the money. I refused because I wanted to refuse. I refused because I wanted to assert my power. I refused because I wanted him to understand that I could say no to him and that there was nothing he could do about it. At that moment, I had absolute power over whether his grandson would live or die. I had it completely within my ability to write a check and to change everything about Robert's world. I had the power to be a hero in his life story. And I chose instead to be a villain. I chose to use my power cruelly. Writing about his daughter had been the most emotional part of the memoir. Because Victoria represented everything that Alexander had rejected in pursuit of wealth and power. She represented compassion. She represented service. She represented the kind of life that mattered but didn't make you rich. Victoria has always been different from me, he'd written. Even as a child, she'd been different. While I was focused on building business empires, she was focused on helping people. While I was learning how to manipulate markets, she was learning how to save lives. While I was teaching myself to see people as competitors or obstacles or opportunities, she was learning to see people as complete human beings worthy of respect and care. I'd been disappointed in her for a long time. I'd wanted her to go into business. I'd wanted her to take over my empire. I'd wanted her to be like me. I'd offered her positions in my company. I'd told her that business was where the real power was. I'd suggested, both directly and indirectly, that becoming a doctor was a waste of her intelligence and her potential. But she'd refused. She'd chosen to become a physician instead. She'd chosen a profession where she would help people on an individual basis, one patient at a time, rather than a profession where she could accumulate wealth and power on a massive scale. I'd thought she was wasting her potential. I was so completely, catastrophically wrong about that. The day after I humiliated Robert Chen in my lobby, Victoria had found out what I'd done. I don't know how she found out exactly. Maybe someone in my office had told her. Maybe one of my staff had felt ashamed of what they'd witnessed and had contacted her. Maybe Robert himself had told her when he came to the hospital where she worked. But however she found out, she'd been furious. She'd come to my office. And for the first time in years, I'd seen real anger in her eyes. Not the kind of anger that comes from teenage rebellion or generational conflict. Not the kind of anger born from not getting what you want. The kind of anger that comes from genuine moral outrage. The kind of anger that comes from watching someone with power use that power to hurt someone vulnerable. "Dad," she'd said, "do you know what you did? Do you understand what you did?" "I refused a charitable request," I'd said, still not understanding the gravity of what I'd done. "I get hundreds of those every week." "You humiliated a desperate man," she'd said. "You laughed at him while he was begging you to save his grandson's life. And you did it deliberately. You did it to make yourself feel powerful. You used your wealth as a weapon to make him feel small." I tried to defend myself. I tried to explain that I couldn't help everyone. I tried to explain that I had a responsibility to my shareholders, to my employees, to maintain and grow my wealth. I tried to explain that charity had to be selective, that I'd set up a foundation that donated millions, that I was already doing my part. "Dad," she'd said quietly, "you have $4.3 billion. Your grandson's life costs $500,000. That's like asking someone who makes $100,000 a year to spend $11.60 to save a child's life. And you're telling me you can't do it? You're telling me you won't do it." I'd remained silent. Because she was right. Completely right. There was no defense. There was no justification. I simply hadn't wanted to help. And I'd used the excuse of being busy and powerful to avoid having to confront that fact. "I'm going to help Robert Chen," Victoria had continued. "I'm going to treat his grandson. I'm going to give my time and my expertise and my genuine care. And I'm doing it not because of you, but despite you. And I hope someday you understand the difference. I hope someday you understand that the kind of charity that costs you nothing, that just requires you to move money around, that's not charity. That's just making yourself feel good. Real charity requires you to give of yourself. Real charity costs you something." And then she'd left. The transformation that came after Alexander's decision to help Robert Chen had been gradual, almost imperceptible at first. It hadn't been like a sudden conversion or a dramatic change of heart. It had been more like a slow erosion of his old beliefs and a slow building of new understanding. He'd written about how he'd started reading about poverty, how he'd started learning about the healthcare system and how it excluded people like Robert, how he'd started understanding for the first time that the suffering he saw around him wasn't because people were weak or lazy or stupid. It was because the system was designed in a way that created suffering for people who didn't have resources. It was because the game was rigged. And he'd spent 70 years benefiting from that rigged game and congratulating himself for winning. "I started asking myself a question I'd never asked before," he'd written. "What is my responsibility to other people? For most of my life, I'd believed that my only responsibility was to myself and to my shareholders. I'd believed that philanthropy was a luxury, something I could do if I wanted to feel good about myself, but nothing I was obligated to do. I'd believed that charity was something I did out of the kindness of my heart, which made me a good person. But now I started to understand something different. I started to understand that having power comes with responsibility, that having resources comes with obligation, that the question isn't do I have to help, but how could I not help? If I have the ability to save someone's life and I don't do it, I'm complicit in their death. I'm responsible. Not because I caused their suffering, but because I had the power to end it and I chose not to. It took a heart attack to fully cement that understanding. The heart attack had been the physical manifestation of a spiritual crisis that had been building for years. Alexander had been 75 years old. He'd been working 70-hour weeks. He'd been stressed about competition in the real estate market. He'd been isolated from his daughter because of his refusal to help Robert Chen. He'd been lying awake at night thinking about the look on Robert's face when he'd laughed at him. And then his heart had stopped. "I was in a hospital bed connected to machines, lying in a room that smelled like antiseptic and fear," he'd written. "And I had what I can only describe as a spiritual experience. I thought I was dying. And as I was thinking I was dying, I realized that none of it had mattered. None of the money. None of the power. None of the empire I'd built. All of it would be gone in an instant. I would be dead, and every building with my name on it, every deal I'd closed, every employee I'd fired to save money, none of it would matter. And the only thing that would remain would be the people I'd touched, the lives I'd influenced, the difference I'd made. And I'd touched very few people. I'd influenced very few lives in any meaningful way. I'd made very little difference, except the negative difference I'd made through cruelty and domination. When I recovered from the heart attack, I made a decision. I was going to step down from my company. I was going to use my remaining years, however many I had left, to actually make a difference. Not symbolically. Not through tax write-offs and charitable foundations that bore my name and allowed me to feel good about myself, but directly, personally, by being present for people in crisis. by exercising my power mercifully. Victoria had been right all along. The most valuable thing I could give was not money. It was myself. It was my presence. It was my willingness to be present for someone in their moment of need. The establishment of the Marcus Chen Foundation had been the externalization of that internal transformation. And working at the foundation had changed Alexander in ways he couldn't have predicted. I established the Marcus Chen Foundation not because I wanted to feel good about myself, he'd written. I established it because I finally understood that this was how I could use the power I had responsibly. The foundation provides free treatment to children with leukemia whose families can't afford it. We provide counseling to families dealing with childhood cancer. We fund research into new treatments. We train doctors in compassionate care. We do the work that I should have been doing all along. And I made Victoria the executive director. Not because she was my daughter. That would have been nepotism, another form of the corruption that had governed my life. I made her the executive director because she understood something I'd spent 70 years not understanding. That the most important thing we can offer another person is our genuine care. Not our money. Not our power. Our presence. Our attention. Our willingness to see them as a complete human being and to care about their suffering. Working at the foundation transformed my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. I met families like Robert's family. I met children fighting for their lives. I met parents doing everything they could to save their children. I met people whose love for someone else was bigger than their own fear, bigger than their own shame, bigger than their own need for dignity. And I understood, finally, what Robert had been trying to teach me that day in my lobby. He wasn't asking me to save his grandson's life because he didn't care. He was asking me to save his grandson's life because he loved him so much that he was willing to humiliate himself in front of a powerful stranger. He was willing to risk rejection. He was willing to be vulnerable. He was willing to admit that he was desperate and weak and unable to solve this problem alone. That's a kind of power I'd never understood before. It's the power of vulnerability, the power of love, the power of being willing to be seen in your desperation. The apology section of the memoir had been the most difficult to write, because Alexander had understood that an apology, no matter how sincere, couldn't undo what he'd done. It couldn't take back the humiliation. It couldn't give Robert back the 20 years of anxiety and fear and struggle. I don't know if Robert Chen will ever read this, he'd written. He's an old man now, like me. He might not care anymore what I think or what I feel. He might have moved on from that day in my lobby and built a life that doesn't require my apology. Maybe he's already forgiven me. Maybe he's learned to see me as someone who was broken and didn't know how to be human. Maybe he's moved past the hurt. But I need to give this apology anyway. For myself, if not for him. Because I need to say out loud, or at least on the page, what I did and why it was wrong. Robert, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I'm sorry for laughing at your desperation. I'm sorry for refusing to help you when I had the power to do so. I'm sorry for humiliating you in front of my staff. I'm sorry for making you feel small and worthless. Most of all, I'm sorry for the 20 years of anguish you've lived with since that day. 20 years of wondering if your grandson was going to survive. 20 years of struggling with money you didn't have. 20 years of knowing that someone with power had refused to use that power to help you. 20 years of carrying shame about having to ask. I can't undo that. I can't go back and change who I was on that day. But I can tell you this. What you taught me has changed everything about how I understand the world and my place in it. You taught me that compassion is a choice. That mercy is something we extend to others. That the most important question we can ask ourselves is not how much money do I have, but how can I use what I have to help someone in need? You forced me to become a better person. And while I don't know if that makes up for the suffering you experienced, I hope it means something. I hope that knowing that your desperation actually changed someone, that your willingness to be vulnerable actually taught someone how to be human, brings you some kind of peace. When Alexander Steele's memoir was finally published, it became a bestseller. Not because it was particularly well written. It wasn't. Alexander had been a businessman, not a writer. The prose was sometimes clumsy. The structure wasn't perfect. There were moments when he repeated himself. But people didn't read it for the writing. People read it because it was honest. It was raw. It was a confession from a dying man about how he'd wasted most of his life and how he'd finally, at the end, learned what actually mattered. The memoir sparked a national conversation about wealth and responsibility. It sparked conversations about how we treat people in need. It sparked conversations about what it really means to be powerful. It sparked conversations about the relationship between vulnerability and strength. Universities assigned it in business ethics classes. Philosophy departments used it to discuss questions of morality and redemption, and whether redemption was even possible for someone who'd spent 70 years being cruel. Healthcare professionals used it to discuss compassionate care. Therapists used it to discuss the transformative power of being truly seen by another person. But most importantly, the memoir vindicated Robert Chen. For years, Robert had carried shame about his encounter with Alexander Steele. He'd carried shame about having to ask for help. He'd carried shame about being humiliated. He'd understood intellectually that he'd done nothing wrong. That asking for help was a sign of strength, not weakness. That his desperation had been real and his love for his grandson had been pure. But he'd still carried the shame. He'd still felt the weight of that moment in the lobby. He'd still remembered the sound of Alexander's laugh. But when the memoir came out, when the world read about how Alexander Steele had laughed at Robert, when people understood the depth of Robert's humiliation, when people recognized the strength that it had taken Robert to move forward despite that humiliation, Robert's shame transformed into something else. It transformed into understanding that his vulnerability had been strength, that his desperation had been a form of courage, that his willingness to humble himself for his grandson had been the most powerful thing in the entire story. Not Alexander's eventual redemption. Not Victoria's compassion. Not the success of the foundation. Robert's willingness to ask for help had been the most powerful thing. On the day the memoir was published, Robert received hundreds of messages from people who'd read it. People thanked him for being brave enough to ask for help. People told him that his story had changed how they understood the world. People told him that he'd taught them something crucial about what it means to be human. People told him that because of his example, they'd asked for help when they needed it. They'd been vulnerable when they needed to be vulnerable. They'd admitted their weakness, and in doing so they'd found strength. An elderly woman wrote to Robert and told him that after reading his story, she'd asked her daughter for help with her medical bills. She'd spent years trying to handle everything alone, trying to maintain her independence and her dignity. And when she'd finally asked for help, her daughter had wept and had told her how grateful she was to be able to help. The woman wrote that asking for help had actually brought her and her daughter closer. It had created intimacy instead of destroying it. A man wrote to Robert and told him that he'd been struggling with his business. He'd been on the verge of bankruptcy. He'd been too proud to ask for help. And when he'd read Robert's story, he'd realized that his pride was more important to him than his ability to survive. So he'd asked for help. He'd reached out to friends. He'd found investors. He'd saved his business. And more importantly, he'd built relationships that were deeper than what he'd had before he asked for help. A young woman wrote to Robert and told him that she'd been in an abusive relationship. She'd been too ashamed to ask for help. She'd been too afraid of judgment. But when she'd read about Robert's willingness to humiliate himself in front of a stranger for the sake of his grandson, she'd realized that her shame was less important than her safety. So she'd asked for help. She'd contacted a domestic violence shelter. She'd left her abuser. She'd rebuilt her life. And she'd written to Robert to thank him for showing her that asking for help wasn't weakness. It was the strongest thing she could do. Robert Chen died at age 87, surrounded by family. He died surrounded by Marcus, who'd become a successful pediatric oncologist and who was using his position to help children with cancer. He died surrounded by Jenny, who'd been Marcus's wife for 50 years and who'd watched Robert's suffering transform into purpose. He died surrounded by their children and grandchildren, some of whom had become doctors, some of whom had become teachers, some of whom had dedicated their lives to service in various forms. And he died knowing that his humiliation had been transformed into something meaningful. His desperation had sparked a change in one man's life. His willingness to be vulnerable had taught the world something about courage and strength. His story had given permission to countless other people to ask for help when they needed it. His story had changed how people understood power and vulnerability. That's the final lesson of this story. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is ask for help. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we're desperate. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is be vulnerable. And sometimes when we do those things, we don't just change our own lives. We change the lives of everyone around us. We change how people understand the world. We change what's possible. We teach someone else what it means to be human. That's what Robert Chin did. And that's why his story matters.